Good morning and welcome to this week's programme, an edition in which we explore from the archives the life and times of one of Ireland's most remarkable writers, Flann O'Brien, born just 100 years ago. Flann O'Brien, also known as Miles Nagopaleen, also known as Brian O'Nolan. His family background, his student days in UCD, Sean McEntee on his civil service career, and how he became a writer at Swim Two Birds, published in 1939, and his Irish Times column as Miles Nagopaleen. Later this morning, this.
He worked very conscientiously, I must say that.
Sean McEntee
Arrived reasonably early at my office. Miles was there before me. When I was leaving, it was generally late in the evening, Miles was then engaged in his own private business. That's to say, he was sitting at the typewriter, typing out his stuff, I think, for the Irish Times.
Miles Nagopaleen, also known as Flann O'Brien, and born Brian O'Nolan, or Brian O'Nolan, was born just 100 years ago.
I think that at his best he had a clarity of mind which saw through humbug.
Sean McRayman.
At his best he had an incisive way of saying things which at times didn't give much room for the graces, the so-called graces of conversation. And I think that he cared about a number of things, really, and that about things he cared for he wasn't prepared to waffle.
Why he got on so well, I think, was that Miles didn't talk as a literary man.
John Ryan, editor of Envoy.
Literary in inverted commas. He was much more interested in talking about municipal affairs, for instance, and the everyday sort of life of Dublin was apparently as much concern to him as anything else. So therefore he could talk with a very wide variety of people on a variety of topics. It could be a bus driver talking about the conditions on the number 11 route, or on the other hand it could be a doctor or a medical student. He had something to talk about to everybody, and as I say, he took this great interest in municipal affairs. He was always giving out about the corporation for this or that or the other, and local government. Of course, he had been in local government for years as, I think, principal officer, so that he had a very wide, very eclectic range of friends, and he had a very wide knowledge himself of a subject in which nearly all the pub goers were fairly familiar with. So there was nothing esoteric about his talk, and therefore that made him very much more acceptable to a mass of people.
The learning, of course, was amazing too. He was a profound scholar.
Another writer and journalist, Ben Kiley.
And the oddities of his learning too that came out in the column. I mean, I'm quite told that his knowledge of railway engines was in fact exact and wonderful. And how a man who was a good classical scholar and a good Celtic scholar could also be a good scholar about railway engines is something I've never quite understood.
I think when I first met him, he was fairly new in the Irish Times. He'd been writing for a year or two in the column, and it was perhaps more or less at its height. That was the latter part of the 40s.
Television broadcaster and executive, and former Irish Times journalist, Jack White.
He was writing then with tremendous vigour, great invention, and the kind of thing that nobody had ever seen in this country before, I think. It was also, as I think I've remarked elsewhere, a particularly unclosed period of Irish life. It was the end of the war. We'd had a period of censorship. It was a very grim period indeed, and this breaking down of barriers of all kinds, I think, suddenly seemed terribly refreshing to everybody.
He was a well-established literary figure in Dublin in the 1930s.
Around the early 30s, Brian and myself literally alternated the editorship of the college magazine, then called Coram Féine.
Niall Sheridan was another friend. They had first met at UCD in the 1930s.
During that period, he displayed his originality and incidentally got me into a bit of bother in the following way. I suggested to him that he might write for me a series of stories of contemporary Dublin life, a sort of Dublin Decameron. And he agreed to do this on condition that he was allowed to write in Old Irish. So I said, fine, far ahead. The point was that only 3 people in the country could read Old Irish: Binchy, Bergen and Best, the famous trio of scholars. So he went ahead with this and apparently was writing the most bawdy possible material, and after 2 months the three old lads were enjoying this so much that they began to tell the stories to the various professors around the place, and eventually it got back to the ears of the president, and I was summoned to answer a charge of publishing obscene material in Old Irish in the magazine, a rather unusual accusation. So Dr. Coffey was a splendid president. He looked like a fashionable Edwardian musicologist. He was reputed never to have used a fountain pen, and he was allergic to the internal combustion engine. He always arrived at the college by cab. And I went in, and on the advice of my legal advisors, and I had plenty of them because the place was stiff with briefless barristers, they had advised me to plead immediately criminal negligence, that I was unable to read what I had published, etc., etc. So I did this at once, and I said to Dr. Coffey that unfortunately I couldn't read Old Irish, and I had published material that I could not read or evaluate. This set us off on a very good start, because Dr. Coffey confessed that he was similarly handicapped himself. So we started off as two underprivileged people unable to read Old Irish, and we got on splendidly.
He was a big man in college, and by that time we were already more or less talking in his language.
Ben Kiley.
After a swim two birds, and Meehan Hall was a very essential part of the scene, where with the parallel dirty lines along the wall where the country fellows would lean instead of going to lectures, and with the room back in that weird architectural museum where country boys were, planking down cards and roaring out the name of God. And then he had where the phrases were like the Puka McPhillamy, through a gap in his teeth he whistled a civil cavatina, and acquired respect because of the treatment meted out to his wife, who was one of the Corrigans of Carlow. And all this had become a sort of lingua franca at that time, so that he was regarded with not only a certain amount of awe, but at the same time a certain amount of fellowship. He had already, it was quite obvious, immortalised the college.
The entire sort of cultural life of the college, such as it was, any societies associated with that were literally within the control of quite a small group. They managed to elect committees, to change committees, to hoist themselves into positions of power in the societies by all sorts of dubious electoral ruses of every kind. I suppose that would have been a good training for politics later. But the astonishing thing about Brian, and the thing that that sticks in my mind, he certainly, from the very earliest time I knew him, he displayed an extraordinary originality. He never wanted to do the obvious, and if he succeeded in doing something, take writing at Swim Two Birds, he would then do something completely different, as in The Third Policeman. He was always moving on to something new, full of ideas, full of invention, and full of mischief, of course.
When things go wrong and will not come right, though you do the best you can, when life looks black as the hour of night, a pint of plain is your only man. When money's tight and is hard to get, and your horse has also ran, when all you have is a heap of debt, a pint of plain is your only man.
We're standing in the back garden of 4 of Oka Terrace.
This is Micheál Ó Nualainn, who has just published a book about his brother, Brian Ó Nualainn, Miles. It's entitled The Brother.
This was a lawn, and it was divided from the rest of the vegetable garden with a long trellis that went right across the garden. And this is the first time that I remember meeting Brian. It was 1932, and I was 4 years of age. And I was playing here, and I had a hatchet. And he must have seen me from the window of the house and probably thought I would do myself an injury. So he came out, and this is the first time I remember seeing him. And he said, of course, the language of our house is Irish. He said, "Sordo, give it to me." And I did exactly as he said. I just threw it to him. It hit him in the most delicate part of his anatomy. Oh, no, not there, but on his ankle. And he hopped around and he used words which I had never heard before. And that was my first time that I can remember meeting him. And some months later, I was taken out of the nursery of the house and I brought up to this room on top of the house, and I shared the bedroom with him. And then this huge trellis, which was 12 foot high, went right across the garden. Occasionally would get knocked down with storms during the winter. And he made a table out of parts of this trellis. And on that table, in this bedroom I shared with him, he wrote, "Let's swim two birds." And whether the molecules of the table got mixed up with his writing, the name of the main character in the book was called Dermot Trellis. So there it comes from the trellis.
Further extract, descriptive of Dermot Trellis, rated occupier of the Red Swan Hotel, Oratio Recta. Dermot Trellis was a man of average stature, but his person was flabby and unattractive, partly a result of his having remained in bed for a period of 20 years. He was voluntarily bedridden and suffered from no organic or other illness. He occasionally rose for very brief periods in the evening to pad about the empty house in his felt slippers, or to interview the slavey in the kitchen on the subject of his food or bedclothes. He had lost all physical reaction to bad or good weather, and was accustomed to trace the seasonal changes of the year by inactivity or virulence of his pimples. His legs were puffed and affected with a prickly heat, a result of wearing his woolen undertrunks in bed. He never went out and rarely approached the windows.
At this stage, when I was about 6 or so, I was knocking around with friends of mine, and one of them said, "My daddy does this," and the other fellow said, "My daddy does that." And they said to me, "What does your daddy do?" And I said to them, "I don't know." And they said, "Ask him." So next evening when he came home out in the garden, I asked him, I said, "What do you do for a crust, if you like?" And he said, "If he got him in some cash, Lord, I have an office in the castle." And yeah, I said, "But I mean, what do you do?" I said. And then he said, "Word I miss your fragrach as a cur dina breezun. Sometimes I'm responsible for putting people in jail." So then I knew what he did. So the next day I went out to see my friends, and they said, "Did you find out what your daddy does?" I said, "I did." "What's he do?" "He's a judge," says I. And it's only when he died a few years later I realised he was a revenue commissioner. One of the people we love to hate because nobody likes to pay their tax.
We carefully divided among ourselves these free theatre and cinema tickets, and also the books that you got to review.
Niall Sheridan again, remembering Brian O'Nolan at UCD.
At that time you could sell a book in new condition for, I think, 2/3 of the published price. So this was a modest source of income, and in the 30s nobody had any money at all. It was an extraordinary time. People nowadays wouldn't realise it. So every penny that could be got, or any kind of work that could bring in a few shillings, was useful. Brian one of the jobs he got was standing at the gateway of the Phoenix Park Racecourse to identify university students. He described himself as, he said, "I'm the modern James Carey." He was the informer, because students in those days got race tickets at reduced rates, so naturally the race course people wanted to make sure they were going into the right hands.